Welcome to the NoDiceNoGlory.com roundtable for the HMS CyberCon Redux. I'm your moderator, Phil Bolger, and I am joined today by Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire and David Thompson, designer extraordinaire.
Oh, or not. But thank you for that. That was awesome.
We'll be speaking today about David's Valiant Defense series, but with the time, who knows? We may talk about other designs he's done. I see By Stealth and By Sea on the table behind him, and we may get to talk a little bit about that. So what I will say is, again, please make sure your camera is off and mute your microphone. If you have a question, please type it in the chat, and I will ask the speaker during the Q&A session. For this format, talking with David, we have agreed that we will do running questions. So at any point, if you have something that you want to say, go ahead and ask. So let's do some quick introductions first. So my co-moderator, Liz, please introduce yourself.
Hey, I am Liz Davidson, and I mostly cover solo board games on my site and channel, Beyond Solitaire. I also have a podcast called Beyond Solitaire, where I talk mostly about historical games, including a lot of war games. And I also review games for the Dice Tower. So I'm all over the place gaming.
Absolutely. Terrific. And David, a quick introduction.
Yeah, so David Thompson, game designer, kind of live in two different worlds. One of which is war game designs, mostly solitaire or with a solitaire focus. And then when I do usually co-design work, that's more in the broader board game hobby, right? Outside of the war game space.
Excellent. So the focus tonight is on David's series of Valiant Defense, which the first two are already out through DBG, Dan Burson Games, which is Pavlov's House, which is about a particular sub-battle of the Battle of Stalingrad, I guess is the best way to describe it, and Castle Itter, subtitled as The Strangest Battle of World War II. So the third one, however, hasn't yet been released. I think it's hitting Kickstarter soon. David, do you want to start by telling us about Soldiers and Postmen's uniforms?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it'll be on Kickstarter next week. So it is the third in the series, the Valiant Defense series. And so as the series name suggests, right, these are stories of forces who hold out against numerically superior, adversaries. So far, the entire series has been set in World War II, and this is no different. So Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms is about the defense of the Polish post office in the free city of Danzig on the first day of World War II. So, coming out of World War I, Danzig was basically carved out as a free city, very heavy German populace, but also Polish presence there too. And there were a few locations that were considered sort of extra territorial elements of Polish influence. And the post office was one of those. So the postal workers knew that as they saw World War II, approaching, they knew they were going to have to hold out against German and Danzig attack. So the postal workers were ready for that, and that's what's depicted in this game.
Terrific. So for everybody that hasn't played a Valiant Defense game yet, what goes into the core of it? Like, obviously it's a little bit in the title, but what do you mean when you say Valiant Defense? Are you talking sort of a glorious last stand kind of thing, fighting against the odds, or is it more this was really hard to hold and they held anyway?
Yeah, it can run the gamut. So in the first two, Soldiers Postman's Uniform is a little different than the other two. So in Pavlov's House, so one thing is it's always going to be you're playing the defenders and you're holding out, like I said, against a vastly superior force, at least numerically. Then that and it's usually taking place, at least a majority of it, at the skirmish level. And skirmish equals, there's a component on the board that is a single human, right? So it's very, very small scale action. So in Pavlov's House, the defenders, you hold out actually for over a period of a few months. So the time scale is significantly different than the other two games. And there's also an operational element that's abstracted in that game. But those defenders are victorious. They actually hold out long enough to wait for the Soviet counteroffensive, and they can be, historically they were successful, and you can win, quote unquote, and hold out. Castle Itter just takes place over a course of a single day. It's also skirmish, but it's exclusively skirmish level. There's no operational elements. And again, those defenders were successful, so they held out until reinforcements arrived. And then Soldiers and Postmen's Uniform is the first one in the series where there's no such thing as winning, right? The postal workers were never going to defeat two different SS units and Danzig City Police. That wasn't possible. And so in the game, you're trying to achieve the same historical feat that the defenders did, which was holding out for basically an entire day against ridiculously overwhelming odds.
Terrific. So one of the features of these games is that they're all soloable. They're designed initially, correct me if I'm wrong, as solitaire, and then I know at least in Castle Litter there's a 2-player component, and I believe there is in Pavlov's House as well. I just haven't played it. But what made you start with this defensive concept as solo? What made you think this was solitaire material?
Yeah, the origin story of the series really goes back to a design competition on Board Game Geek. So there was I think it was a war game design competition. It might have been solitaire. I can't remember. But there was a design contest, and I said, "Hey, I'll try my hand at this." And I designed Castle Itter for that design contest. So it was actually, even though it wasn't the first one published, it was the first one designed in the series. And I think that I should have remembered this. I think that it probably was a solitaire design contest, right? So by the very nature of the contest, I had to design a solo game, and it just felt like, hey, this is cool. You're holding out against all odds. It makes sense from a solitaire design, and so that's what started the series. And then it was well received especially within the war game community, but also the solitaire community. And so because of that led me to the idea of designing Pavlov's House as a sort of follow-up, right? So I asked people who had played Castle Litter what should be the next game in the series, and somebody had recommended Pavlov's House, which is what started the research for that. And I will say that, to your point about it being solitaire, they are all designed to be solitaire. They're solitaire first and foremost. Castle Itter provides a variant, and I like stress variant because I don't think it's actually should be considered a 2-player game, where one side can take the role of the Germans. And then Pavlov's House is interesting because you can play it 2-player co-op, which is my preferred way to play it. You can have one side play the skirmish part and one side play the operational part. It does have a variant where you can have, a player takes control of the Germans. I don't, again, that's just a variant. But Soldiers and Postmen's uniforms will differ from those because I'm not allowing a adversarial option in that, because I'm not comfortable with a lot of the actions that the Germans did in that, right? Like, and we can get into the details if we want once we start talking about history, but literally, burning people alive and stuff. And I just didn't want anybody taking action in a game I designed like that.
Absolutely, totally reasonable, and I think that's ethics in war games, or ethics in games in general, something that always comes up. What could you portray? So totally reasonable, totally understandable. So one of the things that I've enjoyed about Pavlov's House and Castle Litter, which are the two that I've played, is how difficult they are. This is not a solitaire system that is easy to dissect, and I think most well-designed solitaire systems are not easy to dissect. It takes you a while to get the hang of it. How did you start with something simple and build it into the layered but still streamlined system that it became on execution?
Yeah, well, it's since I started with Castle Itter, it is the simpler of the two, right, from a design perspective, because you're only dealing with that skirmish level component. Honestly, like, this is going to just sound kind of hand wavy, but it just a lot of iterations in playtest, right, until you get it right. I mean, all the games started from doing the historical research, then kind of deconstructing the history, modeling that out, and then saying, okay, these are the key elements that I want to evoke in the game, right? The games are not models, right? They are games that try to evoke very specific historical elements. And I think that's an important distinction. So that was my key sort of cornerstone of the design. These are the key things that I want to be able to happen and be reflected in the game. And then I needed to just design and iterate through it until I felt comfortable with where they landed. And then obviously by having, some of the foundation elements, at least at the skirmish level for Castle Itter, obviously I could riff off of that for the other two.
So speaking of the moment and the feeling that you're trying to evoke in your game, what attracts you to these valiant defense scenarios where people are facing almost impossible odds, or in the case of soldiers in postmen's uniforms, a game that you can't win except through endurance? What is it that pulls you about these particular themes in your games?
Yeah, I mean, so I like military history, right? So that's just the research part of it is super fun, right? Um, so I enjoy that. I really enjoy World War II. And Liz, I know you've heard me say this before, so I apologize. You'll have to hear me repeat myself. But World War II is sort of, in my mind, like a magical time period in in military history for me, because there's a ton of detail, right? We can get down to the very individual level if you want for detail. But for me personally, it's not too modern, because once we get to more current conflicts, I don't feel super comfortable designing games around those. So it's this sort of sweet spot. And then, as I already mentioned, all of these games are at the skirmish or personal level, and that's what I really love. I really like, understanding what the individual defenders were going through, and that's modeled down to the individual counters, right? Like all the counters have the likenesses of the actual people, and I think that's important, right? Because ultimately, the goal here is to help players understand the history and pay respects to these defenders.
So your games are notable for the in-depth research that you do leading up to them. Have you got a streamlined process at this point, or is it just something different for every game depending on the scenario you end up researching?
Yeah, it's super different depending on the game. And that's why I put By Stealth and Sea, because even it's not Valiant Defense, it's probably the most historically researched, that in Pavlov's House. There's some battles like Castle Itter where there's just not a lot of historical detail, and there's a couple of really good texts, and so you kind of it's you almost feel cheesy, because you're like, well, these two books are going to be my research for this game. And then there's games like Pavlov's House that I have probably 20 to 30 books that I physically own, and at least, probably another 30 sources that I used. And so there is no one approach. Some are just easier, more streamlined than others. And then you've got Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms, which is a whole nother level, because it included actually traveling to Gdansk in Poland to do the research, getting a lot of Polish language and German language material translated.
So that's very interesting in terms of background. But before you get to the point where you decide what are you going to research, how do you select a battle or a vignette even as being worthy of the Valiant Defense title? Like, what makes you pick these particular scenarios?
Yeah, it has to be. So, for both Pavlov's House and for Soldier and Postman's Uniforms, both of those were calls I made out to the community, and were suggestions that people gave me. And when I make the calls, I tell them, look, I want it to be super small scale, right? It has to be small enough that the number of defenders are relevant in the game, which is really, we're talking like probably 40 people. It can't be so modern that there are living combatants, because I don't feel really comfortable with that. It has to be something I can find, material on. So it can't be so old that I can't find. So it starts to narrow down the potential pretty quickly. And of course, people always you get the same suggestions over and over. You get things like Arnhem and stuff, and those are cool. They're just not the right scale for what I'm trying to depict. Now, I'm not saying the system couldn't be changed, from a scale perspective or whatever, but for what I'm wanting personally to work on, those are sort of the factors that go into it.
So the other thing that we're talking about, so with the small scale, so we've talked a lot about the research that you put into your games, which is something I really enjoy. So we've talked about you using GIS points to map an upcoming game about the Battle of Mortain. For By Stealth and Sea, we went through a long period where we were messaging about you researching exactly which ships were available to attack in the harbor at which time, and you were really excited recently when you had found a map of the post office for Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms. How much detail do you think is really necessary for your games, and how much of it are you doing just because it makes you happy?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, it definitely makes me happy, right? Like I love finding these little nuggets of information. So here's a couple of examples. So in By Stealth and Sea, every single historically possible ship is in that game, right? You don't need any of those. You just need a handful of counters that are worth 3 points for the most part, without for ships that aren't that important. But every single ship is represented. And I had sent you guys some images when I was researching the air defense units that are on the operational side of Hollow's House. In the game, that means nothing at all, right? Like it doesn't matter what units they were. But for me, when I was doing the research, and the fact that those units that potentially provided air defense cover for Pablo's house are the ones depicted in the game, I think that for me, when I go through that process to research that and I put it into the game, I think that people maybe just even subconsciously like recognize the fact that the games have this level of historicity like in them, and so that maybe they don't know it, but it's reflected in the design itself. And maybe that's just me wishful thinking. I don't know. I remember one time somebody sent me an email on Board Game Geek, and they had realized, because I never really talk about this explicitly, they had realized that all of the stats in the combatants, the defenders in Pablo's house, are based on the weapons that they have, and all of those weapons were based on their actual role that they had, and all of that stuff is in an appendix in the game. So so the actual defender had this weaponry, this is how their stats are in the game, and all of that was there. And it was cool that they reached out and they said, hey, I saw this, because only one person's ever noticed that, right? But that's makes it worth it. So.
And I know that the depth that you research at also, I think, increases your emotional attachment to games. And, we've talked about your research into Mortain. I think that's always going to be the one that packs the most punch for you because of your personal connection.
Mhm.
But, what parts of your research have meant the most to you on a personal level? What have been some of the most striking things that you've discovered while doing research into your games?
Yeah, the single most poignant thing that I've ever worked on is, and you know this, Liz. You might not know the answer, but we've talked about this before. Is there is a counter in Soldiers and Postmen's uniforms of a little girl who, because there's 3 non-combatants in the game, right? Because they really were. There was a custodian, his wife, and their daughter, and they're represented in the game. And in the actual battle, she was burned to the point where she eventually died of her burns. And so, her being represented in the game, her story, all of that, I think is the most. You can't play the game and interact with the counter without feeling something, At least for me.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think it's one of those stories that you can bring to life through gaming, that it's important that people hear. And I'd use that as a bridge for, it sounds like one of the things you do with every game you make is make an effort to tell the story of the battle, to not just necessarily say, here's 2 orders of battle, slam them together and see what happens, but rather to say, this is how this battle proceeded. Are who these people were. These are the routes they came through to try to aggress, and how that worked out. When you're looking at the story of a battle, what strikes you as the most important thing to look for? Is it the compelling narrative, the brutality, or is it simply, as mentioned, the skirmish level in a Valiant defense?
No, I think it's like, well, for sure it's, they held out, right? That's kind of a given because it's in the game, in the line of games. So once you get past that, it's like, well, what made this battle unique? What were the unique elements about this that need to be reflected? And so, every game is different. Like in Castle Itter, you have the professional tennis player, right, who can like escape from the castle and go get reinforcements. And people comment on that all the time because they get to actually experience the narrative in the game, and it's really hard, right? So you have to work really hard to do it. It's really impactful, and it really happened in the real world. And you get to live that narrative that happened in the actual battle. And so I try to pull out all the little narratives that occurred in each battle and make sure that the players get to relive those narratives themselves. And I think that's, people will remember Castle Itter because they got to defend, French former, heads of state, or because they had a tennis player bound over the wall and escape. So those are the things that made the battle itself memorable. So people should be able to experience that.
So what do you think overall about using games as a way to teach history? Like, obviously, if you know about Stalingrad or if you know about Castle Itter, you're going to get something out of the game. But how often do you have people come up to you and say, wow, I had no idea this had happened in history and your game taught me that?
So this is a softball because and Liz knows this too. Liz and I talk a lot, obviously. So so I just had the pleasure of a professor from Norwich reaching out to me, and she's a professor of military history. She specializes in women in military history, and I'm sort of a feminist, right, myself. So this was even more awesome for me to hear. But she used Pavlov's house in her one of her classes, right? She recorded a video of herself doing a review of Pavlov's house that she then gave to her students. And in the video, she referred to the fact that she said that the game was very historically accurate. So it was like the best compliment anybody could probably ever give me, right? Like I've had Undaunted, the Undaunted series, and War Chest reviewed by Shut Up and Sit Down, which get like hundreds of thousands of views. And her video was way cooler to me. I'm way more proud of that.
So also David won't tell you this because he is humble, but your work into Pavlov's house is also interesting because Pavlov's house is such a big deal in Russia because it represents a certain degree of heroism. There's also a lot of propaganda that kind of minimizes the air support that the people in the house were getting to upgrade how tough they sound, which, I mean, they already were tough. You don't really need to do that. But there's a little bit of dispute about who was really there, what kind of support they were really getting. So Pavlov's House, the game, is interesting because it is your own interpretation, David, of who was really there, what really happened. To play your game is to play your interpretation of how that battle went down and who and what was there. And you had to sift through a lot to draw that conclusion.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? So if you Google Pavlov's house and you get the one paragraph pitch, you're going to hear 30 defenders defended an apartment building for 3 months against hordes of Germans, right? That's what you're going to hear, and it was defended by Pavlov led the defense, hence the name. And none of that's really true, right? So it was a Russian storm group or Soviet storm group that took the building that Pavlov led, and he was in charge for like 2 days of 3 months. I didn't know any of that, right? So I read the first, like everybody, you read about it, you're like, oh, this is cool. And I started designing a game about them defending a building, much like Castle Itter. And I started reading, and the more I read, the more I realized, no, this was the Soviet propaganda. And it was essentially not really disputed by anybody until the Soviet Union, until the end of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union turned into Russia, and Russia sort of, for a brief period of time, opened itself up and allowed Westerners to go in and do some studying. And a lot of information came out that, no, actually these, they did defend the apartment building. That is true. They had tons of help, artillery, resupply, air defense, you name it, communications, all sorts of exterior sort of elements. And that's what ultimately led me to change the design to incorporate all the operational elements. But yeah, so it's funny because even if you pick up a book about, say, the entirety of the Battle of Stalingrad, you're going to get a page or so on Pavlov's house, and it's all circular reporting, right? It's all the German version of what happened or the Soviet propaganda version of what happened, none of which challenges sort of the status quo until just in recent years. And so, yeah, like I said, even the fact that it was led by Pavlov is not even true.
So this is a great line to go down because you're mentioning sort of all the research that's been done. And you talked earlier about how much research can go into any one of these games. So where do you start? You mentioned starting, presumably you find a paragraph on the internet. Do you then immediately head to the library? Do you buy plane tickets to Gdansk? Like what do you start off with?
Yeah, when you and your wife and kids live in England and you're always with your kids all the time, you and your wife get plane tickets to Gdansk and leave the kids at home so you can justify that a trip away from the kids. That's the first thing you do. But no, but seriously, in my day job, I'm an intel guy, and I'm primarily a what we call geoint, right? So like satellite imagery, geospatial information, that kind of stuff. So I'm a very I want to know about the topography of the battle. I want to know all that stuff. And so usually the first thing I'll do is I'll read like a executive summary kind of, real quick version of the battle. And then the very first thing I'll do is find maps about the battle layout, because I want to understand what the situation was that they were in. So I'm looking at, well, let's talk about soldiers and postmen's uniforms, right? The very first thing I did was, where was the post office? What was situated around it? I got aerial photography from the time period. I'm fortunate that the post office persisted, and now it's a museum, so it's still there. The building's still there. So I was able to get 3D models of it, so I could look at line of sight and all those sorts of things. That's the first thing I like to do, is get an understanding of the battleground, and then I'll start digging deep, and I'll just read all the material usually, and like I might jot down some notes. I won't do any sort of game design mechanism stuff, none of that at all. But what I will do is I'll note if, let's say I'm reading a passage and I'm like, that's really interesting and unique, and I think that needs to be represented in the game. I won't concern myself with how I would do that, but I'll make note of that so I can come back and make sure it's included, right? And then it's just literally, like Liz alluded to earlier, it's doing the research is just like the game design. Like you do the first 80% of it really, 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 really fast, right? And then it's the last little bit that takes you forever. And so when I decided that it was important that by Stealth and Sea, that every ship that was actually in Gibraltar, Algiers, or Alexandria is represented in the game, it meant reading through log after log after log of ship movements and stuff like that, and tracking down authors of books and visiting them at their houses to interview them and stuff. And so you just getting that last little detail is where you're spending all your time, and you just have to decide, is this part of what I'm trying to include in the game?
Absolutely, makes total sense. We have a question from Douglas in the comments. He wants to know if you have any plans to take the system out of the World War II context. He mentions World War I or perhaps Korea.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would like it to try to stay true to those tenets I mentioned earlier, right? Both in terms of scale and not being modern and recent enough to be able to get the detail I want, right? And so as long as it meets all of those, anything's on the table. And I have flirted with the idea of doing something more modern. If I was going to do a truly no kidding modern battle, I would do Outpost Kading, which is, people might know that's a famous defense, small scale defense in Afghanistan, not long ago at all. So that's one that if I was to do something, I would do it on that battle probably, but it would literally mean me going and reaching out to everybody that was part of the actual defense, the people who are still living, and make sure they're comfortable with it. And it's just, I just don't know if that's realistic or not. But certainly World War I would be fine as long as as long as the scale was right and I could find the information I needed at that, personal level. Yep.
All right, terrific. So it sounds like it's pretty open so long as it stays within that criteria.
Yep.
So we'll have to see what comes next. It may be too soon to ask what comes next, considering Soldiers and Postmen's uniform hasn't hit Kickstarter. But we talked about the process of getting started. Are there paragraphs on the internet you've read recently that have piqued your interest for what might be in game number 4?
Well, so I have a list of things that I've considered in the past, and I haven't started on any of those yet. This is what I think I'm gonna do when the Soldiers and Postmen's uniform Kickstarter goes live. I'm gonna post another request and say, hey, what should the next game in this series be? And so I'm gonna be open-minded, and hopefully I'll get some good suggestions. I know that Dan of Dan Verson Games is the publisher for the series. He definitely wants more, right? And so I'm in a little bit of a good problem to have situation right now, where I'm kind of backed up in terms of what all is due. I have deadlines on, but I would like to get at least the research for the next game done in 2021. But yeah, I'll cast the net wide and see what people are interested in. I know I'll get tons of people mention the Alamo and Arnhem. Those are I can bet on that.
So I have a question. We've been talking a lot about sort of your ethical boundaries and what sorts of game topics you're willing to cover. And so I am going to poke at you. I've done this before. Something not territory that you haven't covered. But By Stealth and Sea is kind of about the bad guys in the sense that it's about Italian frogmen trying to blow up British ships. What made you decide that was comfortable territory for you, and what made you open to designing from that perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll be honest. So the a little bit of a tangent, and we'll get back to actually answering your question here in a second. But the By Stealth and Sea it started out as a commission, I guess, right? And it was very limited. It was just one of the missions. The game actually has 9 missions. It has every one of the major Italian human torpedo attacks in the Mediterranean. They're all represented in the game, but originally it was just going to be one of them. And it was commissioned, and I designed it, and then the contract fell through. I won't go into the specifics; doesn't matter. But then when I signed it with Dan with DVG, it opened up the opportunity to make it a much bigger, more robust game. So in that early time period where I was like, hey, I commission, let's look at this thing. I did, like, I'll be honest with you, I was like, I don't really know how I feel about this. This is a little strange, taking on the role of the Italians, you're attacking British. But the important thing about it is the Italian operators they're military, right? They are special forces guys, but they're not like SS guys. Now it's interesting. The unit, the 10th flotilla, I won't try to pronounce the actual Italian name because I'll butcher it and people make fun of me. But the unit that actually is responsible for the human torpedo operators after Italy changes sides, right after they surrender, many of them don't, and many of the operators don't, and they start doing truly horrific stuff. So there is a element after the game finishes where some of these people went on, or at least the unit itself went on and did some bad things, but none of that's represented in the game, and none of that reflects what these guys were responsible for. And so it's kind of like, I'm not going to design a game where you're taking the role of SS doing horrible things, but I mean, if you're playing Pavlov's House, you're playing Russians against Germans, and it's like I know when we talk about conflict of heroes, and you're like, the heroes are Russians and Germans. I don't know if I agree that these guys are heroes. It's kind of the same thing, right? So as long as you're regular army guys and you're fighting the fight, that's the actual conflict. I think I'm okay with that.
Yeah, that's a reasonable line to draw, and I think ethics in gaming brought it up earlier, but it's always worth talking about for what stories are you communicating and what context are they communicated in. So we have a question from Mitch, of all people, hiding out in the comments, and he wanted to know what is harder to develop, a multiplayer or a solitaire game, and he says specifically no help from Liz.
Well, I'll tell you the answer is multiplayer, meaning when people use the phrase multiplayer to mean more than 2, that's the hardest to design, right? 2 players is fairly easy because I usually have a design partner, and solitaire is easy because I can work on it by myself and then kick it to blind playtest groups. But multiplayer is hard just from a practical perspective because you got to get enough people together during the design process to actually test it as a multiplayer game. Now, if the question is which is harder out of 2 or solitaire, man, that's tough. Probably 2-player games are harder because there's like an implicit. The most challenging thing about a 2-player game is it requires the finest level of balance of any game, right? Because imbalance is easier to identify in a 2-player game than any other type. So it's probably the easiest for probably solitaire, then probably 2-player from a practical perspective, and then probably multiplayer for me because I just don't. I've actually, right now I'm working on 2 different designs for the first time ever where it's a 3-person co-design process. So all of those are multiplayer games, but very seldom do I work on multiplayer designs.
So I have a question that's a little bit outside of the total scope of this, but it is based on my knowledge. You are somewhat of a rarity amongst game designers in that you design both war games and non-war games. What distinguishes the two in terms of what makes you gravitate towards one or the other? Or is it sort of, it's all the same stuff underneath and I like both equally?
Well, so there was a period early on where I didn't really know what I wanted to design, right? So a couple of my first games are not like many of the others. Like the first game I ever had published was a post-apocalyptic Euro by Queen, which was, unlike anything else I've designed. And then I had a very light card drafting game. But if you put aside those like early designs, I've basically fallen into most of what I design now is either solitaire war games or usually 2-player, kind of like combat games with like Euro mechanisms kind of in, feeding through them. And so it's pretty clear. I love both of them. And what I'll do is if I'm working by myself, and this is usually like in the hours of 4 to 6:30 in the morning when I'm supposed to be doing game design, but Liz and I are chatting on Facebook. She's very distracting. She gets most of my designs. If any of my designs are late, it's because Liz is texting me on Facebook. But
how dare you?
I know. But so if I'm working by myself, like it's early in the morning, I'll work on my solitaire war game design stuff, and then in the evenings when I'm doing co-design work, it's always going to be non-war game stuff. So I've never designed. My co-designed war games are always my partners, like the history lead. So when I did By Stealth and Sea, Nicola, who's the co-designer, was doing the history. He was leading that part while I was doing the game design. And then with By Stealth and Sea, Michael Cockman was leading the history part while I was doing the design. So yeah, that was a long answer, but basically, I love them both equally. They're both my children, but it's just from a practical perspective is how I divide up the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of value in, obviously designing games, but also in playing games of a lot of different types. I think you can find unusual mechanics in places that you may not have seen. So the concept of combat games with Euro influence is interesting. Now, it is worth noting that the Valiant Defense series has some unusual mechanics. It's not necessarily anything totally out of the woodwork, but one I wanted to talk about was the paths, the attack paths present in both. What made you decide on that for a mechanism, and then how did you develop it?
Yeah, it's funny. Anybody that's familiar with the Victory Point games, States of Siege games, right? They'll know the pathing that goes into those. And people will oftentimes call Pavlov's House, because it was the first one, they'll like, hey, it's a States of Siege game with extra stuff added to it. The irony of that is I've never actually played a States of Siege game. Now I've got Zulus on the Ramparts. I've taken it out. I've read the rules. But what actually happened was Mark Johnson, who's a friend of mine, has a podcast. He has 2 podcasts. One's called Board Games to Go, but he also has a podcast called War Games to Go, which is a fantastic podcast. Been going on for years. When I was doing the initial design concept for Castle Itter, and I decided, hey, I want it to be about, it's a solitaire war game and it's going to be about this battle, but I have no idea how to design it. I was listening to Mark, and he was talking about the States of Siege games, and he was talking about these are solitaire games where you're defending it. And so I just looked at the board and I saw the paths, and I was like, oh, that's cool. I'll integrate paths into it. And so literally it was just the inspiration for the pathing system from States of Siege is what led to that.
So I was actually thinking about a different thing about your games that is unusual, or at least about specifically By Stealth and Sea. So I'm hoping my copy of it will arrive soon, so it's on my mind.
Someday.
But but the very first mission in By Stealth and Sea, normally when people think about a game, they want to already kind of experience the whole thing, or they want a certain level of, I don't know, I guess balance. But the first mission of By Stealth and Sea is crazy because none of your equipment works. And you are really struggling because you're kind of new at this whole frogman thing. And, it's one of those missions that really brings out storyline over kind of min-maxing and strategic gaming. And I like that you took that risk. I'm really excited to see where that whole campaign will go when I get access to the whole thing. But is that something that you'll do for a war game, but not necessarily for a non-war game? What under what circumstances are you willing to take that particular narrative risk in a game?
Yeah. So Leah, let's talk about a few things there. There's a lot to unpack there, right? So first of all, I debated personally, and so let's just elaborate a little bit what you're talking about. So in By Stealth and Sea, you're going your first mission. There's actually a couple of missions that never even got off the ground, and those aren't represented in the game, right? Like they didn't even get to the place they were trying to attack. But the first mission is the first time the operators were ever able to get their human torpedoes going. They went to go to attack, and it didn't go well, right? Like their torpedoes are falling apart, and so etc. And so it happened, and like in the game, it's really, 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 really hard. That first mission is hard because the odds are not in your favor. It's going to go bad, right? And so if this was a game that I was designing to pitch to a publisher, I would not be able to get away with that. There's just no way. No publisher would take, because in board games in general, people play the first thing, right? The first game or whatever, and many of them will never play again. And so let's take Undaunted, right? Because Undaunted is my most played game by far. I see people constantly sharing pictures of the first scenario of Undaunted, which is not great, right? It's okay, but it's supposed to be a learning mission, right? Like, and it's not supposed to be representative of the game, but that's what maybe a plurality or majority of all people's experience of Undaunted is going to be. So in this game, if the first mission is super, super, super hard, but I know a couple of things. First, I know that Dan, DVGs, they support me. And so when I give it to them, they're going to just say, okay, we trust you. We're going to take that, this is what you think is important, and we're not going to change it. So I have an extremely good situation to be in from that perspective. So I have a publisher that's going to support that decision. And I'm fortunate that I think the solitaire community, but I think especially the board game solitaire community, is going to be forgiving of that for exactly the kind of reasons we're talking about, right? It's what happened historically, and that's evident in the game, right? You're getting a mission summary, that they weren't historically successful, and that things are going to go awry, and so you got to experience it, right? And I would push back and say, potentially, if it was too easy, people might say, well, like, I didn't get to experience the actual difficulties, right? And so yeah, I'm just, it's sort of like one of those situations where all the stars align to allow me to do it, and so I just took that chance, and hopefully people are okay with that.
So that's an interesting thread to pursue. How do you draw the line, or when do you draw the line between realism and playability? Like, what can you draw a universal line, or is it always context dependent?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it is informed by context. Like, so, let's take the soldiers and postmen's uniforms example. People have asked me, like, oh, is there a way to win, meaning the defenders don't lose, right? Don't get defeated ultimately by the Germans, and that's a line that I didn't want to take. Like, that's silly, right? Like, it's fairy tale, because there's no situation that was ever going to happen. In the month or two leading up to the defense of the post office, the Polish military gave them a false sense that potentially they would be, reinforced or rescued or whatever, but that was never going to happen. And so it's, in my mind, that's like bordering on silly. But, in Pavlov's house, you need to be able to win, meaning defend it and hold it, or lose, meaning get beat, because both of those were totally realistic possibilities. And so it's trying to find, like, what is the actual realm, like, what was the reality, what was the likelihood of that reality, and what was the realm of the possible. And you want to be able to somewhere fall in that spectrum, right? That's, to me, I think that's what's important.
Yeah, I think it absolutely makes sense where you're going with that. So just so everyone's aware, we got about 15 minutes left. So if you have more questions, now is the time to ask them. Otherwise, I've been thrilled with everything I've heard so far, and I'm sure Liz has too. So we'll continue picking at you. So the next question about where you draw the line with realism goes back to the earlier conversation about ethics. So is it worthwhile to have something in there that is ethically meaningful, even if some folks are going to be a little frustrated or upset with it?
Ooh, wow. Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, I think so. Right? Yeah, for sure. Right? Like the game. I mean, the games are not meant to be like social commentaries, right? Necessarily, but for sure, you should. You shouldn't shy away from something that people might be upset about or whatever if you think it's important to include in the game, right? I mean, I already mentioned it earlier that the little girl in soldiers and postmen's uniforms is something that I could have not included because I know that some people might be upset about it. But when you weigh it, I think it's important. I think it's really, really important that that when somebody plays that game, they understand that these people attacking were heartless assholes, right? And like that needs to come out. I'm sorry, but that needs to come out in the design. Like people need to understand that like they knew that these people were inside. They knew that these were not military combatants, and yet because they couldn't defeat them, first of all, they probably should have been attacking them to begin with the way they were, but because they couldn't defeat them conventionally, they decided to pour gasoline in the building and set it on fire, right? Like that needs to be in there. Um, yeah, I don't. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a hard balance, and it's not one that has a universal answer. But what you said definitely makes sense, and I agree. It's worth putting in the narratives.
Yeah.
So we do have a couple questions in the comments. The first is not so much a direct question, so much as a question of values. Douglas brings up that there's an idea about what's more important. Is winning more important, or is experiencing a great game system more important? Do you think that most consumers have a preference between the two?
I think that yeah, I think that their consumers do, and I think it's different depending on the type of consumer. So for sure, in the non-war game world, like well, let's talk about like the Euro market. The Euro market, it better be a really, really good game, right? Like the game system better be solid and balanced and all of those things. Uh, Once you start getting into like the war game or the Ameritrash like narrative style games, people are way more forgiving about the game system and they care way more about the experience that the game delivers, right? Um, for me personally, like I look at my shelf when I get to like the war games on my shelf. Many times I buy them knowing I'll never play them. I take them out, I set them up, I look through, I read the history, I look at like the layout, and I've gotten what I wanted from it, right? And so it delivers. But I would never buy a Euro game to lay out and like look at it. That's ludicrous. And so each game like promises, generally speaking, each game promises something, right? And so it just needs to deliver on that. When I went into that point, I bought a couple of games. They were small games or whatever on the Battle of Mortain, and I laid them out, and it's like put these units wherever you want along west of this point. I'm like, no, 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 no. I want you to tell me where the unit was. Like that's the point of that's the reason I bought it, right? Like, and so yeah, it's very uh consumer dependent, and you can largely put consumers in certain buckets. I think that's fair.
Also, David's the man of the hour, but I think solo players especially expect to lose a lot. I think that as a consumer base, solitaire gamers are the most likely group of players to be willing to accept games that are almost impossible to win.
Yeah, I that's funny you should say that. So the guy that I designed War Chest and Undaunted and stuff with, he and I were just asked to do a single page game for a magazine. And so it's like a page of rules and a page of and I was like, well, if it's a magazine game, let's just make it a solitaire game. And as we were designing it, it's almost impossible to win. And he's never designed a solitaire game before, and it's almost impossible. And I was like, well, it's possible to win, and it's a solitaire game, so that's about as good as it's going to get, because you're basically telling some, because it's like Friday. You play Friday until you beat Friday, and you never play Friday again, right? So like that's how, in my opinion, it's the same. You're right. Solitaire gamers want to be challenged.
So the next question we have is from Kevin. How important is component quality to you? And as you are more successful, do you find that you have more leverage on this with publishers?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of spoiled. I think DVG does really good job on their components, right? So like big chunky counters, and I'm super spoiled because I'll just tell Dan what I want. Like, hey, this game needs 1-inch counters, and then they just do it. And I know many people might not have that opportunity or whatever. I think components are important, but I think they are like like they're what makes a really, really good game, maybe that last little bit of great. But I don't know. It's never going to make or break a game for me, right? Like I'll play a game with subpar components if it's a fantastic game. That's not what's going to decide it for me. So it's like a nice to have, I guess, but it's never going to be something that drives my decision. I would much rather work. Let me put it this way: I would much rather work with a publisher who's good to work with, who communicates well, who is fair, etc., than a publisher that I know will have good components. Right? Like that's pretty low on the important list.
Absolutely. From Bob, we have a question about, can you talk about how you got involved in or what drew you to the board game adaptation of Sniper Elite?
Yeah, that's a cool story. So I when I first started designing games, one of the very first games I designed is the game that went on to become Undaunted Normandy. And so at Essen Spiel 2014, I pitched that game to Osprey. At the time, Osprey was just starting their board game division, and the guy who stood it up, his name was Duncan Malloy. He was super interested in the game, but things were crazy for them at the time, so it kind of sat in a little bit of a limbo period for a while. But eventually, Osprey signed it, and Duncan and I got to know each other really well. And then a couple of years ago, Duncan went to Rebellion Entertainment. Rebellion's a huge company. They do video games, they got TV, comic books, all sorts of media stuff. And they decided, Duncan went there to stand up their board game division. And so Duncan, this is like the state of board game design. Duncan tweeted me, I guess he direct messaged me on Twitter, and he was like, "Hey, what do you think about designing a game about being a sniper? How would that work?" And so he and I kind of went through this like, cat and mouse like discussion about sniping in general, right? And then eventually it was like, well, would you be willing to design Sniper Elite? And the irony of that, or the funny thing about that is, I don't play video games. Like I haven't owned a video game console since I don't like Nintendo, maybe PlayStation, or maybe the first PlayStation. So to design Sniper Elite and to be true to it, I had to go out and buy an Xbox. I had to play literally like hundreds of hours of Sniper Elite, learn how the game played, deconstruct the game, just like it was researching a war game, right? So to answer the question, I was asked to design Sniper Elite because I had an existing relationship with Duncan, who was the guy who had stood up both the board game company at Rebellion and Osprey.
So I may play my my online stalker card here a little bit too much, but I thought I saw in the comments somewhere you'd also played quite a bit of FTL.
So yeah, I mean, when I say I don't play board games or video games, like 99% of the time I don't play them, but every once in a while a game will land and I will just devour it for like 2 or 3 days, and then I won't play it again. And so FTL, or Faster Than Light, Slay the Spire, and Into the Breach. Those are the 3 games over the last few years that I've really gotten into, played until I beat them or whatever measure it is, and then put it away.
One of the things I find fascinating about that, for those that have not played FTL Faster Than Light, is that it has a lot in common with a well-designed solo game. It is utterly punishing, and you have to really design your ship very well. So I got a kick out of reading that a designer that specializes in solo games like FTL.
Yeah. So do you know, I'm going to reveal, this is horribly embarrassing. I'm going to reveal something to you. I was so addicted and so obsessed with FTL that I knew that I would never stop playing it until I beat it. So I cheated. I can't even remember the specifics, but there's some way to cheat in FTL. And so I did that because I knew that that's the only way I would stop playing FTL. So I cheated, beat it, and then I never played it again. It's true. I admitted it. I'm ashamed, but I'd be playing it right now, not talking to you guys if I didn't.
Oh, God.
Cheating to save yourself.
That's right. Yeah.
This sounds like the time I disappeared into Skyrim for 2 months of my life.
So we got another question from Mitch, along with a disclaimer that I'd like to say just so everybody hears it. So we actually don't have a hard stop. This is the last Cyber Wars event for the night. We don't have to turn over the room, so we can keep talking until you guys get bored. So Mitch wanted to know, though, what was your first game love that when you played, you knew you'd be a gamer for life?
I don't know if I knew it at the time. I'm trying to. It's hard. Like I have a really, really, really bad memory. One of my design partner, Trevor, he's my main partner. One of the things that we are running jokes is that like what he brings to the design partnership is he actually has a memory where I don't. So I can't remember certain things, but I can tell you that the game that has had the most lasting impact onto my design sensibilities is A Few Acres of Snow. And if you know A Few Acres of Snow, it makes sense, right? Like it's a war game Euro mashup that has deck building, that kind of like, all of the action is driven by some of the simple deck building mechanic, and it has a spatial element to it, right? And so I think Martin Wallace in general is a brilliant designer. I think that a lot of his games are way underdeveloped, right? Just to be totally honest. But I think as far as the core designs themselves are oftentimes pretty genius. But I would say that A Few Acres of Snow continues to be, I definitely remember it being, wow, this is awesome when I first played it. And it continues to be one of the most influential games to me, for sure. And people that haven't played it, you should check it out. It's probably hard to find. There's a game called Hands in the Sea, which is very similar to it. Arguably a better designed game, but they're both brilliant.
I'm a Martin Wallace fan in general, and I like A Few Acres of Snow. And I was very surprised when I first played it. I played it with a friend of mine in Illinois. I was surprised to find out that the internet had very strong opinions that were not as favorable. And the more I've gone back, the more I've scratched my head and kind of said, I understand you guys don't like it that it isn't polished, but can't you see what's been done here? So I don't know if we're fully aligned on that, but it sounds like we share an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say anybody that says like the Halifax hammer, blah, 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 just, I mean, you probably 99.999% of all people would never know it if they didn't read about it. And then they just flip out and say it's broken and blah, blah, blah. And that's just ludicrous, right? Like it is a really, really good game. It has one broken thing that you probably would never impact you. So just enjoy life and play games and have fun. Don't stress over things that don't actually impact you.
Absolutely. And for folks that aren't aware, it's incredibly counterintuitive to activate. Like you have to, it's one of those 9,000 IQ plays that is virtually impossible to play test for.
Right.
So totally agreed there. So we have from Tyler, he wanted to know, outside of the Undaunted expansion, Dire Alliance, and Soldiers and Postmen's uniforms, what's next?
Undaunted Reinforcements will come out next summer. War Chest Siege will come out next, like March, April, which is the next expansion for War Chest. Soldiers and Postmen's uniform is going to hit Kickstarter, so it'll come out next year. It starts to get murky. I'm working on the next Undaunted, right? So that'll be summer of 22, unless something catastrophically bad happens. That's what's taking up most of my life right now. Of course, the next game in the Valiant Defense series will be a huge focus area. I think I either can't talk about it or it's in design now for anything else. I don't think I actually have anything else that's scheduled to come out. I just had this is, if you guys will indulge me for a second, I just had a game come out in German that'll come out in English next year called Switch and Signal, which the reason I bring it up is it's a game that I had in work for like 6 or 7 years. And I designed it specifically with my mom and dad in mind because it's a co-op train game, like pick up and deliver, family weight train game. So that's just, I'm really proud that that's finally coming out. So, because I did design it for them specifically in mind.
Nice. So I think that's about it for everybody in the comments. So I'm going to take the opportunity of having the mic. I'm super interested in Dire Alliance. I've liked the Sadler brothers are another pair of my favorite designers. I got Brook City from them a few years ago, and it's probably the, like, I guess, action game. I would say it's kind of in its own genre. There's not a lot of police action games out there that hits the table most often. So how did you end up working with the Sadlers? How did you meet
Yeah,
those guys?
that was actually extremely similar to my Sniper Elite story. So, oh yeah, and we should say the Sniper Elite is going to come out next year. I forgot about that. So, so Brady Sadler, right? He was playing Undaunted. He really enjoyed it, and he tweeted out like, "Hey, this is a really cool game." He and I never talked before that, but he tweeted out, "Hey, this is a really cool game. It would be awesome to be like an adventure game with this system or whatever." And I replied and I said, "Hey, let's make it happen," or something like that. And so within a couple of days, Adam and Brady, myself, and Trevor, right, this is the co-designer for Undaunted, got together and we said, "Hey, let's make it happen. We'll do a game. We can't do Undaunted X, right? It can't be like Undaunted something else. It has to be a different game." But just in the same way that War Chest and Undaunted have a little bit of shared DNA, so does Dire Alliance and both of those two, right? So it's kind of like three related games are all cousins to one another. So it came out of that. Now there was a period, I will say, where so working with Adam and Brady, and I'm not joking when I say this, is probably been the best relationship with any publisher I've ever had from a communication perspective. We chat every single day. They're amazing guys. But it did go through like a theme change a couple of times. And so anybody that's played any of my games, hopefully the theme, like you get that I'm a heavy into theme, like that's important to me. And so like to have a theme change, it's not just like, oh, we'll just paste on this thing to it to the same stats. Like you actually have to like do some re-engineering of stuff. So it did go through that. But the end product, this Dire Alliance, so for people that don't know, basically Dire Alliance is a board game, which it's in this case Dire Alliance Horror, right? So it's a horror themed game, and it's also a set of miniatures, and you can either get the game or you can get the miniatures. You can get both, right? And all the miniatures are specifically designed to be used in the game, so it's not just a bunch of miniatures that just kind of coexist. They're specifically for it. And in the game itself, like Trevor and I designed the head-to-head battle mode, and then the Sadler brothers took what we designed and they riffed off of that to make their own solo co-op raid mode. So what's important about that, it's not just a solitaire version of the battle mode. Like it's its own whole thing that shares some similarities and underlying mechanisms, but they're actually different experiences. So you actually get like, I mean, it's like a battle mode game and a solo raid mode co-op game, and then a set of minis. So it's a lot of interesting things happening together, and it's cool. I'm super excited about it. I've never had a minis game before, right? So other than Sniper Elite, which has minis in it, but I wouldn't call it a minis game per se. So this is my chance to have some cool looking minis on the board.
Did you get to influence any of the mini designs, or then any I should be looking out for that have the David Thompson stamp?
Well, so we never really influenced the actual mini designs themselves. And certainly the theming of the game was a collaboration between primarily me, Trevor, and Brady, right? Brady's kind of leading if you know the Adam and Brady, you know that Brady's the more thematic leaning of the two. So, and then Adam's the one that's kind of spearheading all the minis development. But that was sort of a collaboration, but Brady would take it and run with it. I'm really happy with what came out. I think the minis look awesome, right? Like I'm biased, obviously, but I think they look really, really cool. And so if the game is successful, then there will be Dire Alliance, whatever, sci-fi, whatever, whatever the next genre is, and they'll be fully interoperable, interchangeable. So you could play your Dire Alliance horror guys versus your Dire Alliance fantasy or sci-fi or whatever we do next.
So I got one final question for the night, since we're talking about sort of your non-war game portfolio as well. We talked about this before, but the state of war games, I think, is changing, and the newer audiences are interested in things like Waros and sort of hybrid design structures. Do you see that as a trend that's continuing to develop, and where do you see yourself in that development?
Well, Waros are definitely my favorite type of game, right? I would say like light, quick CDGs, like games like 13 Days or Watergate, and then Waros those are my loves. It's hard because I'm so into them that it feels like it's growing, and so it's hard to like really detach yourself and make an objective assessment about that. I think it is. I think that area is growing. I think it's super important for because I think that by having that bridge across the two communities, that's how you're going to grow like the more Grognardian Hex Encounter war games, right? So like I will play a Hex Encounter war game any day. That won't be like, I'm not going to pull out Normandy 44 to play as my first choice, but I will absolutely happily play it. And to get to that point, it's a lot easier to say, hey, let's go from Catan to Quartermaster General to Normandy 44 than it is to jump into Normandy 44, right?
Yeah,
yeah, I hope it's growing, and I think it's good for everybody, honestly.
I think there's something to be said for a pipeline into wargaming. Not everybody is prepared to jump into, one of my favorite Hex encounters is Mark Herman's Empire of the Sun, which is just an absolute masterwork.
Yep.
But trying to get the average person to go, hey, do you want to go play in the Pacific Theater for 7 hours? Okay, I need you to read all these texts first, and I hope your geography is good because you're going to need to know every single atoll in the Pacific.
Yeah.
I've scared people away doing that. So I have a great appreciation for a pipeline. And I think there's really a lot of space in that early to middle weight for let's get people interested. I would also add, and I'm going to grab the soapbox for a second here, as a historian, I like anything that gets people to talk more about history. And whether or not what they read into it is something fantastic, like the tabletop role-playing game Achtung Cthulhu. It's World War II, Cthulhu, but it's a way I can talk World War II with people that ordinarily wouldn't. Or it's the same thing with simple games that if they feature a battle they like or a system that they like, I can usually get them to sit down. Whereas I have no prayer if I, again, just hit them with Empire of the Sun. And Empire of the Sun's a good game. I can't imagine folks that struggle with mediocre war games on the higher end, how they ever get them to table.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome point. And I'll tell you, if you guys will indulge me, allow me to get my soapbox for a second. If you make a war game or a war themed Euro or whatever, for the love of God, please include like some designer notes or a little historical, like one page. I opened up a game recently. I won't say what game it was. I was so excited to get it. I opened it up and I was like, I've got a rule manual here, but I know nothing about this battle, right? And part of the reason I got the game was to learn about it. I mean, yeah, I can go research the battle myself, but I want to have a little bit of insight. Preferably, I'd like the designer to talk about, what inspired them or whatever. But just, yeah, please, if you're thinking about designing a game, please just include that. Because I mean, we're the likelihood that you're a war gamer playing a war game that doesn't care about the history is like 0. So indulge us, please.
All right, so I'm going to ask for one more call for questions in the comments, and assume I don't get anything, my final question tonight is on something that we've talked about in general, and this follows another one of my passions, and that is aerial ISR. So earlier this year, you revealed that you were reading a book about, I believe it was black bat fights out of Taiwan, which I think was still called Formosa at the time, over the PRC and the USSR. There we go.
Yeah, this is something that's on my back burner, right? So like, if you know me, you can oftentimes determine what I'm planning to potentially design based on what I'm reading about 3 or 4 years ahead of time. So I would say that that this is an amazing story, right? Whatever you would want to call this, like the collaboration between the CIA, the Air Force, and the Taiwanese Air Force as they conducted ISR overflights over mainland China, and it will make for an amazing game, right? I think that the challenge is trying to abstract what took place over more than a decade from a strategic and operational, like upgrades and investments and all that stuff, because I want to model that, but I want to model also the tactical individual potentially overflights, right? Like my first love in life, probably from a work perspective, is air defenses, right? Like I'm a huge ground-based air defense guy. And so the opportunity to include some ground-based air defense or some interceptors against these flights is just too good to pass up. So yeah, this is definitely something I want to put together a game on. And there's, as far as I could tell, there's not much like that out there. So
Yeah, absolutely. ISR in general is perennially undergamed. It's hard to game correctly, and especially due to the modernity constraints, there's a lot of it you literally can't. But ISR as a field is old and goes back well before anything digital. But aerial ISR, somewhat new, still hard to game. I think you've really touched on the sweet spot in sort of the early to mid Cold War as an area that could get examination, get a lot brought to light. I think aerial ISR is really neat, but that's a different passion. I'm not going to bore everybody to death. So with that, I will offer one more time to my fellow moderator and to David. Do you guys have anything you want to leave folks with?
Just thanks, David, for your time. Thanks for everybody for coming.
Yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. I appreciate it. This is fun. As always, we said before we went live that I knew that we wouldn't have any problems filling the time because Liz and I can talk forever. And Phil, it's been awesome chat with you. This has been really fun. So yeah, just thanks for having me.
Well, terrific. NoDiceNoGlory.com and the Historical Miniature Wargaming Society would like to thank David Thompson and Liz Davidson for their time today. The video from this session will be uploaded to YouTube when there's time available. You can also visit the NoDiceNoGlory.com message boards to continue the conversation. Thank you very much for joining us this session.